Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest is Douglas Lynam. He was a former monk. He's an entrepreneur, and he's now become a financial advisor. We're going to talk about the book From Monk to Money Manager, Taming Your Money Monsters. Very, very unusual journey. He was actually in the Marines as well, then a Benedictine monk, now a financial expert. So got a lot of life experience I'm sure he brings to bear on everything he does. So welcome, Doug.
Thanks, Richard. It's a real honor. It's great. It's an honor to be here.
Well, tell me a bit about your history. So, I bet if you wrote out a resume, you'd be like, this is weird. How did I go from here to there to here?
Yep.
So what's some of the highlights of what you've done?
Yeah, my resume looks like it was designed by Salvador Dali on a sugar high. It's kind of all over the place. But yeah, so I grew up outside Chicago, a little town called Naperville. It's now a pretty big metropolis these days, but when I was there, it was a farming town. And, I grew up in a pretty affluent family, but when my parents divorced, from my childhood perspective, it felt like money got weaponized, and my brothers and we all kind of rebelled against what we thought was mistakenly, I thought we looked at the world of finance and capitalism and business as sort of dirty or nasty or evil or something. Somehow, we were just projecting our childhood daddy issues on the whole economy, which didn't make any sense. But I sort of rebelled first by running off to join the Marines, and I thought that was probably I was trying to impress my father and, be a manly man who could do manly things. And I realized that unresolved anger issues and high explosives were probably a bad combination. So after graduating at the top of my class from Marine Corps Officer Candidate School, I actually turned down my commission and became a Benedictine monk. I realized if I was trying to find, if I was going to leave the Marines, what would be a higher calling? What would be some path that would help me try to find the meaning of life, look for, answers to deep philosophical questions? And it was also a great way to annoy my parents. There couldn't be being a monk where I was a Benedictine monk for 20 years and thought I was leaving the world of money and materialism behind. And it was a great adventure in many, many ways. But in an ironic twist of fate, about 2-3 years after I arrived at the monastery, our community went bankrupt because we all hated dealing with money. We all thought we had these sort of negative money mindsets, what I now call them money monsters, these sort of unconscious psychological patterns that we project onto the world of our personal finances and then even onto the whole economic system, and that maybe derail our financial lives in unhealthy ways. And so, basically we took the vow of poverty a little too seriously. We got ourselves in some real financial pickle. And, so by ironic twist of fate, it fell to my shoulders to sort that mess out. I became the business manager for the monastery. It took me about 2 years to, first I had to learn something. I was so financially illiterate at the time, as was everyone else in the community. And so it took a while to figure out, how does this whole money thing work? And then how do we get to the debt problems we're having? How do we get out of it? Et cetera, et cetera. So School of Hard Knocks. And then after that was resolved, monastery guests would come to our community looking for spiritual advice. And they would often ask me to pray for them. And I'd be like, sure, happy to do that. But actually, a budget might work a little bit better to solve some of your problems. That if we actually, one of the great realizations I had is that a lot of people's spiritual struggles often have a financial component, either that's a direct cause of them lurking in the background as a secondary issue. And if I could resolve people's financial stressors, that you could dramatically improve the quality of their lives and reduce a lot of suffering for themselves and the people that they loved. And so I started doing that pro bono I was doing that for, a solid 20 years in the monastery. That was my form of service and gift back to the community. And then at the same time, I was in a teaching order. So every one of us, all the monks, we all taught college or high school. I was the chair of the mathematics department at a fairly prestigious private school at the time, and started teaching econ and personal finance as an elective for the kids, because I thought that was really important, not to send our kids out into the world financially illiterate like I was. And then, after 20 years, the monastery sort of started to crumble. We weren't getting any new members. It was dying out, and a whole host of other reasons. It's a long story, and it's in my first book, From Monk to Money Manager. But essentially, I then decided to leave the world of monasticism and become an investment advisor, take some of the skills I learned out into the world and try to, use them as a tool, to see money as a tool for love and service. How do we help people have a healthier, more ethical, more sustainable relationship to their finances so that they can relieve the suffering for themselves, and then have the tools to see money as a tool to help alleviate wider suffering, and so that you can have the resources to fix the crack in the world that you were born to fix.
All right, so I got a lot of questions here. So I'm picturing standing before me a Marine, a young Marine, and then a monk, and then I don't know, an insurance salesman, but a registered investment advisor. Well, registered investment advisor, financial planner. Now that you have the perspective, what does the mindset of those three avatars look like?
Well, I think the avatar of the Marine just didn't want to deal with money at all, and both the Marine and the monk avatars were what I would call had a really avoidant attitude towards money, and just didn't want to have to. The Marines was nice because everything's sort of taken care of for you in a way. Financially, make a lot of money, but your basics are covered. You don't need to think too hard as long as you you can manage a budget. And then in the monastic life,
but you're disciplined though. You're disciplining yourself, and so you're getting that at least. But you just feel like, I don't have to worry about money. I can just do my job, and I'm good.
Right, exactly. But then when I got to the monastery, I was trying to I thought the monastery was solved. Again, and I wouldn't have to worry about it. I wouldn't have to think about these things. I wouldn't have to take responsibility for it, because the community would take care. I would just do my job, teach my classes, and come home, and everything would be fine. And it was sort of like sticking my head in the sand and not seeing the reality around me of what was going on, and allowing, through negligence, essentially self neglect, or just self-sabotage, or just general ignorance, allowing along with everyone else in the community, to allow our financial situation to deteriorate to a point where it was really problematic. And then I would say the flip side of that, I would say those other avatars really had a very dualistic, simplistic, maybe childish notion around money, that it's either all good or it's all bad, it's good or evil. They're trying to put things in these black and white boxes of good and evil, and putting money and capitalism and materialism solidly in the negative category, and not realizing that maybe taking Matthew a little too seriously. Matthew says somewhere that the love of money is the root of all evil. And I think that's when you dig into the ancient Greek, it's a much more nuanced statement, because there's lots of different words for love in Greek that we don't have in English. So it doesn't really translate well, but maybe to a more healthier understanding that money is kind of the root of everything, good and evil. You can't feed the hungry or clothe the naked or tend to the sick without money in your pocket, unless you've sort of mastered the art of multiplying loaves and fishes. So to understand that money really does make the world go round. And so the question is, how do you make it go around what? What's going to be the axis of an ethical framework that we can use to have a healthier, more grounded, more sort of soul-centered decisions around our finances?
So, okay, when you started taking care of the monastery's finances, who was taking care of it? Just someone in a financial position? And did they still have, how did they feel about money? They just did minimally whatever was needed to be done? What happened?
Yeah, well, there's one monk is usually assigned or elected or volunteers to be what we call the business manager. Every organization needs some sort of business manager who's watching the books, and that was one of the brothers, who was a very good man, very kind, very warm, very generous, but just didn't have a lot of financial training, and so maybe didn't make. Well, there was a lot of things going on. It wasn't his fault exactly. It was a collective fault. But essentially, what I would call falling into the let go and let God delusion. That somehow, because we were doing good work in the world, we felt like we were living a spiritual life. We were sort of living a good life in some way that would translate necessarily into some sort of material security that God would take care of it. And it turns out that God's not going to work a miracle to solve a problem that you have the power to fix. And so it's kind of an abdication of personal responsibility, I think, is what was the fundamental crux of it. We were all playing hot potato with the finances. No one really wanted to deal with it or face the issues. And so it kind of just got buried until it became a catastrophic situation.
Well, what kind of concepts started to change your mind where you felt like you were getting an understanding of money and then a degree of control with your own finances and then with business finance?
Oh, that's a big question. So it took time. It was a gradual process, but a lot of it was just the biggest step for me was just becoming financially literate, is to realize that the world of finance is a foreign language. And if you don't know how to speak that language or read, write, or speak it fluently, you're always going to be kind of behind the eight ball. And that it was a real lack of knowledge, I think, was the real problem fundamentally, and not really understanding or giving our finances the respect that they deserved in order to make sure that the community was on a solid financial footing.
Well, I don't want to give away all the material, but like, how many money monsters are there? Let's talk about one or two of them, since you devil people.
Well, we could talk about my type, I'll poke at myself. So my newest book is called Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. Now, the Enneagram is a very complicated personality typology system. I don't know if you're familiar with it or if your readers are, but essentially, my book really tries to ground the Enneagram in the latest research in neurobiology and childhood developmental psychology to understand key aspects of our personalities. And so your personality has many facets to it. But to be maybe a little simplistic, we could break it down into 2 buckets and say you have a nature component, which is your DNA or your gene expression. And that's fairly fixed for the most part, but different stressors can activate genes and things like that. But then you have a nurture component to your personality, which is how you were raised in your childhood environment. And the Enneagram explains the nurture portion, a portion of the nurture portion. I know that's a little confusing, but a portion of the nurture portion of your personality to describe how your ego necessarily evolved in childhood to protect you against the biggest stressors in your childhood environment and they're sort of necessary in order for you to develop an individual, what we call in psychological terms, we would say to individuate and differentiate from your caregivers and from the world around you. And so turns out there's only so many ways you can design the basic structure of an ego, kind of like there's only so many ways you can design the basic structure of a car. Like there's, the car you drive.
It's archetypes, right?
Yeah, it's archetypes. So there's infinite variety of cars. The one you drive is totally unique. You got a unique year, make, model, dents in the bumper, whatever. But we can sort of break our cars down into archetypal categories like sports cars, SUVs, compact cars, and we could do the same for ego structures. And so there's 9 basic ego structure defense mechanisms that we can form in childhood with lots of subtypes and lots of variety inside those types. But essentially, the book explains how those 9 archetypal patterns form, what they are, and then layering on top of that what I call the attachment theory of money, which is based on the attachment theory of relationships, if anyone listening is familiar with those. If not, basically what I'm saying is that the goal, of course, is to have a healthy, secure relationship to money in all aspects of our financial lives. But when we can get derailed, the way the money monsters show up in one of 2 ways. One is what I call the anxious type, which would be people who are maybe too obsessed about money. Think of like Ebenezer Scrooge or the TV show Succession or Billions, where people are too obsessed about money to the point where it's causing suffering for themselves and the people that they love around them. So they have an anxious and maybe unhealthy attachment to money, and too acquisitive, too greedy, too neurotic about it. But then on the flip side, and this is where I fell into as a young adult, what I call the avoidant camp, where we just hate dealing with money, where we push it away, we unconsciously reject it for a whole host of reasons, which are unique to our Enneagram type. But essentially, you have these sort of 2 poles, and most of us don't fall neatly into one camp or the other. So whether we're anxious or avoidant, we can also be mixed. We can be what I call maybe a jumbled style, and what that looks like So there's what I call the 4 pillars of finance. So the 4 pillars of finance are going to be earning money, saving money, investing, and then giving. So earning, saving, investing, giving. These are kind of the 4 pillars of your financial life. And I mean, a lot of people who might be anxious in one area, but avoid in another. So to give you an example, someone might be a high earner, might make a lot of money. They're good at the income part, but they spend everything on stuff. So everything goes out in the form of conspicuous consumption. They're always chasing the next shiny object. Yeah. And so they never get to the investing or the giving part. And so then people might be good at earning and saving, but they hate investing. They're terrified of the market. They never, capture the power of compound growth that the market offers. And then there's some people who might build a fortune, but they never really use it for anything meaningful. It becomes an egoistic self-aggrandizement project rather than seeing money as a tool to really, make the world a better place around us, and how you can use that as a tool to, like I said earlier, fix that crack in the world that you were put here to try to bring to some resolution.
Okay. So you said the Enneagram will cause a weakness for people along any of these 4 axes, I guess I call it ESIG.
Sure.
Just for an acronym.
So what kind of things do you see? I guess just taking the concept and running with it myself for a second. Like I know some people that they don't make very much, but they save like every penny, but they're also like cheapskates. They don't seem to enjoy life. They're always constantly feel like they're being cheated and they don't want to spend on anything. And it's just like a fear-based approach. And then, the people that are just like blow the money everywhere, don't care. I don't just somehow come together. That's no good either. Like, what other major archetypes do you see in people's behavior?
Oh, that's a lot to go through. I have to go through all the 9 archetypes and all the money monsters but I'll give you one example. I'll give you my type. So I'm what's called a type 3. There's 9 types again in the Enneagram, and none of them are better or worse than the other, and the numbers don't matter. The numbers are just placeholders. But essentially, let me try to explain how the Enneagram works in my particular case, and then maybe it will give you a little bit of a sense of how it works in general. But it gets a little technical. But one way to think of it like this is that when you're born, you had a physical umbilical cord that connected you to your caregivers. And that physical umbilical cord had to be cut by a sharp scalpel, by a sharp knife. And that allowed you to be physically independent, so to speak, from your mother. But immediately at birth, we develop what I call a psychological umbilical cord. So there's a egoic codependence that you develop to your caregivers in childhood. That's necessary because then you don't really have much of an ego structure when you first come out of the womb, right? You're pretty helpless. So your parents have to do all the driving for you in the early years of your life. But over time, that psychological umbilical cord also has to be cut, just like the physical umbilical cord had to be cut in order for you to individuate and be a fully separate, conscious human being. And what we know from the neurobiology is that there's that psychological umbilical cord has to be cut by one of 3 of the sharpest emotional knives. So in the limbic system of all mammals, there's really just 3 core negative emotional circuits in the limbic region of the brain. This is true for all mammals, mice, dogs, cats, birds, all of it, and even in humans. Now, there's higher orders of obviously emotions that we can layer on top of that, but the negative emotions are running off of either we call the anger circuitry. So it's anger, sadness, or shame. The sadness, shame, grief, they're kind of all interchangeable. And then the third one would be fear. So anger, sadness, and fear are the 3 sharp negative emotions that we experience. And one of those 3 you got a little bit more of in your childhood holding environment. So which one of those you typically, in how the way you were disciplined, like how did you receive the no's when you were a child? Because no's need to be enforced. You need to set boundaries on children. It's essential. It's necessary. And those no's tend to need to be backed up with some kind of force, whether it's anger, fear, or sadness and shame. I'll give you, so there's these 3 core emotions, but then there's 3 ways to process that emotion. So you got either more anger, sadness, or fear. And then, now this is a little tricky in how this works, but essentially you can either take that negative emotion and you can internalize it, direct it towards yourself, which kind of gives you kind of it's like giving yourself an emotional wedgie. You can take that pain and you can externalize it. It's a bit like having a food fight with the world. You direct it outwards, or you can do both. And you can have, that both that internalized and externalized. You could deal with that anger, fear, sadness by internalizing and externalizing. So that's why there's 9. So there's 3 core negative emotions, 3 ways to process that emotion. And that's what gives us the 9 archetypal patterns in the Enneagram. Now, that's a lot. And I realize I fire hosed you a bit, but let me bring it down to a concrete example. So in my case, I'm what's called type 3. And what that means is I have both an internalized and an externalized sadness or shame, which means my ego structure is designed in such a way that I tend to feel sadness or shame about how I perceive myself. And I have this externalized sadness or shame about how I think other people perceive me. And that what that creates for type 3s, it does it for all of us. It creates our deepest unconscious fear. And the deepest unconscious fear for a type 3 is that we're fundamentally worthless, that we don't have any value in the world. And so then what we do to compensate for that, to try to overcome that, is we become the type 3, which is called the achiever. I call them the race car. I give them car name metaphors are helpful. So what 3s do is we tend to try to achieve things. We want to win the race. We want to run the marathon, start the business, write the books, be successful by the standards of the society or culture around us in order to get these pats on the head to validate us, to overcome this deep sense of worthlessness that we have. And that can get us into a lot of trouble with money. So let me just pause there, see if any of that makes sense, and I'll go into the money a little bit more deeper.
It makes sense. I don't know. So besides identifying the money monsters, what's the next step to help yourself? Like what chart should you have where okay, things are getting better?
I'm headed in the right direction.
Yeah, well, you need to know your money monsters first and how they show up. So the money monsters for type 3, the avoidant money monster, I call them the barrier, meaning they tend to dealing with their finances. 3s, we tend to equate our net worth with our self-worth. So if our net worth is low, our self-worth tends to be low. And that brings up all this shame and sadness that we feel. So we tend to bury our head in the sand, not want to look at our finances and not want to deal with it and push things off and procrastinate. And I'll deal with that tomorrow. And that can really devastate your financial life. And it can manifest in a lot of different ways and in different categories. Remember, earning, saving, investing, and giving. But then on the flip side, the avoidant 3 is what I call the blinger, meaning they tend to be good at making money, but then they tend to blow all their money on stuff. They want the status symbols. They want the fancy car, the big house, because those things because social status symbols are a great way to gain social status. And so it's a cheap way of doing it, but it's a misguided attempt at getting approval by standing out by your conspicuous consumption. And so those are the two money monsters. It gets much more complicated than that, of course, but I'm giving you a high level overview.
So older, all those things just don't seem to matter very much. And it's like, it's like, I don't need anything. I have food, I have a car, I have my family, I have a house. Like, I don't need anything, I feel like,
So that helps, but there's other monsters that I and everyone else deal with. At least age just kind of help out.
Yeah, because as we age, our Enneagram type isn't fixed. It has a growth model built into it. And so as we age, hopefully we gain more wisdom, more maturity, and we can tame these issues or some of us don't. Some of us kind of just come out with a healthy relationship to money because of how we were raised. And that's great. Kudos to those people. But for those who are really struggling with their finances, either they feel trapped in their wealth or they feel trapped in their poverty, then I think this book offers some tools for helping alleviating those issues.
Well, what are some notes of feedback you've gotten that really surprised you or made you say, yes, the book's having a positive effect?
Oh, just, people reaching out. I get fan mail regularly, seeing all the reviews on Amazon and Goodreads, it's getting 5-star reviews. So it's really taken off and just get a lot of the positive feedback loop has been tremendous.
So how does having been a monk help you, or does it help you? Like, what did you learn from doing that you apply to your financial stuff today?
Well, I would say, certainly being able to know what's essential, right? Not being caught up in the materialistic trap, being able to have a much more contemplative approach to my financial life, a much more emotionally balanced approach, and being able to take the contemplative wisdom that I learned in the monastery and bring that into my financial life and see that those things are connected, that your financial life and your spiritual life are not separate. That's the great insight of spirituality, is that everything is interconnected. And so when you see that interconnection inside yourself and you're able to be at more peace with your financial life, then you're going to find a lot more peace throughout the rest of your life because you aren't facing this constant nagging stress of having to deal with the financial challenges that are in front of you that can be very overwhelming.
And I guess, you know what it's like to live with very little.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's a mental safety thing in your head, If I lose it all, I lived with a monk for 20 years. I could do it again if I had to. Again, just it's not scary.
A little bit. It's still scary. I mean, yes, but as we age, there's healthcare, there's retirement, there's you don't want to be. I don't want to spend my golden years scrounging for ramen. I would like a little more creature comfort than that.
What about being a Marine? What did that teach you, and how did that inform how you were a monk and then how you are as a financial advisor?
Well, I think the Marines gave me a lot of discipline. They helped me grow up a lot of ways, gave me a lot of leadership training, which I'm very, very grateful for. A lot more self-confidence. I wasn't an athletic kid growing up, so I kind of went to the Marines to prove that I could do it, and I'm really proud of what I accomplished there. So yeah, deeper self-confidence, self-assurance, and the ability to know when to take charge and know when to step back and let others lead. The leading and follow, because you can't be a good leader until you know how to follow. So it's being which role is appropriate in a particular circumstance, and how to work as a team and overcome difficult challenges.
And is faith from all the years you spent to now, is it still informing everything you do, or has the faith subsided because you've been involved in the money side now for so long?
Oh, I think the faith thing just gets deeper and deeper. If you're it doesn't matter what your spiritual practice is. If you're doing it with mindfulness and intentionality, then it should hopefully be getting richer and richer and much more nuanced as I age. And so I find that it just keeps getting better. I didn't join a monastery with any faith. I went looking for my faith, and it's certainly always a work in progress. But I feel closer to God, divine source, whatever words you want to use now than I have at any point in my life.
Do you feel like anything is missing? You kind of checked a lot of the major boxes in terms of life experiences. Is there anything else that, if you had time or wish, that you would go into?
Oh, there's always things. I just went through a divorce about 2 years ago, so the dating scene as a former monk is always a little tricky. And so there's things in my life that I would like to grow and improve upon, but for the most part, this is a really good place to be.
Okay. And for the people listening, which book should they start with if they want to start looking into the money monsters and the enneagrams?
Well, then the book for those people would be Taming Your Money Monster: 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram, and you can find that on Amazon, booksellers everywhere. You can go to my website, DougLynam.com, DougLynam.com, and you can find my books, you can find my coaching services, you can find investment stuff, all kinds of good resources there. But that would be the place to start if you want to go a deep dive into the psychology of money. And then my first book is a good primer if you want to become financially literate, if you want the nuts and bolts of that. The first book, From Monk to Money Manager, is really a how-to book. How do you do budgeting and bookkeeping and insurance and taxes and all those things that are essential to kind of get your foundation under you. And then the second book, really Taming Your Money Monster, is a really deep psychological exploration of why smart people do dumb things with their money.
Okay.
And how to overcome it, how not to fall into those traps over and over again.
Well, very good. Well, Doug, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, explaining all this. And like I said, I think it's really cool that, by accident or circumstance or deliberately, you did 3 very different things, but made it into a nice cohesive whole with a lot of rounded experience for you,
Thanks, Richard. Appreciate it.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.